If you are enjoying this podcast and other podcasts on the Dragon Wagon Radio Network, be sure to check out the Dragon Wagon Shop. Awesome t-shirts and mugs from your favorite shows so you can tout your podcast pride, all while supporting your favorite indie podcast network. And make sure to check it often for new items and limited time designs. So shop now at dragonwagonshop.com and get your dragon swag on. It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to another exciting episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. I'm super excited about this particular episode today because for a number of years now, as we've been doing the podcast, many of you have written to me and asked me to bring this guest on the program. And it's taken us some time. Many of you know, who are regular loyal listeners, that we just started welcoming international guests on the podcast as we figured out the technology and the time zone changes. And I'm so thrilled to finally invite to you, fellow Quillers, our first discussion, I hope one of many to come, with a renowned guest, and he is Alexander Waugh. Alexander, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
We're so glad to have you, and I know that at the time that we're recording this and the time that it will be released to listeners, you just recently gave a presentation to the Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable, I believe, about some recent, or maybe it's not recent, but revelatory research that you have done into a name that we really haven't talked a lot about on this program, but who I think is certainly a very significant player in the story, and that is the mystic, the alchemist, the astrologist known as John Dee. How did that presentation go?
I think it went very well indeed. I was actually dealing with an aspect of John Dee, which he was very interested in, very familiar with, which is cryptology. And I don't know if you are aware of this, but in the Shakespeare authorship world, there are people who are very, very enthusiastic about that side and people who are utterly disgusted by it. And one of the reasons for that is that the Baconians, who seem to precede the Oxfordians in eminence where it came to trying to say who wrote Shakespeare, a lot of them spent a great deal of time looking into the cryptology. And to be very honest, they made slight fools of themselves. For instance, they took the very simple view that Francis Bacon's name was represented by the numbers 33, which is Bacon, and 67, which is Francis. And then they trawled all the way through the first folio and found any example of what they thought was 33 and 67 and said, there you go, you see, Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare. And this came into a lot of ridicule by people, mainly, of course, Stratfordians, who want to stop anyone saying that Shakespeare is anyone other than the Stratford bard. And so there was this enormous amount of ridicule, and Oxfordians, consequently, with some sense, many of them said, we don't want to go anywhere near the cryptological because it ends up making fools of us and we get mud on our faces. And I have to admit that I was one of those too. I didn't want to get involved in cryptology for that reason.
What changed your mind? What brought you around? If you originally thought, oh, this is a hot potato that we don't want to touch, but now suddenly you've been doing a lot of research into that, and you've been producing, I know, on your YouTube channel, several videos with regards to cryptology and cryptograms and anagrams. What changed your mind?
Well, what I realized is how these things are done and how they're made. There was actually a book published, I think, 1957 about Shakespeare cryptology by some people called Friedman, who were very up in cryptology and understood it. One of the points about a cryptogram or something that is done cryptically, especially one using numbers and alphabets, is it's done by the people at the time in such a way that it cannot be refuted. That's the whole point of it. So if someone comes up with an anagram and says, "Oh, look, this is an anagram of Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare," you can say rubbish for a great number of reasons, because you can say, well, why is it put there? Who is telling us to look there? On what authority are you turning this particular word or set of words into an anagram to mean that? And you'll usually find that it's all built on quicksand. But when you actually see a proper a cryptographical piece of work that's been done on purpose, it is done in such a way that it's built like a tungsten fortress, and it simply cannot be refuted and it cannot be knocked down. And one of the ways we know this is because they're very obsessed, the Renaissance mind, with this idea of three. So threes are all, they say, that everything in threes is perfect, they say. So what they do is they triangulate a code so that you see from three different directions that it's correct. So each side will therefore confirm the other two sides, if you see what I mean. By the way, I should just warn your listeners here and now that a lot of the work I've done on this, which, by the way, is by no means all that I've done. I do a lot of work outside of cryptology, but I have to warn your listeners that a lot of this work is very, very visual. So in trying just to discuss it with you in a podcast, we're going to have to be quite imaginative if we're going to allow the listener to understand what we understand from looking at it.
Absolutely. I understand that completely. And it's one of the reasons why I want to make sure that throughout the program, we remind people that they can find a lot of your work and the visual parts of your work, because you have a magnificent YouTube channel that you produce a wide range of content for, and that you have for several years now. And so there's a library there available for listeners to go to. What's the easiest and fastest way for people to find your YouTube channel, to access your videos and see the visuals that you're talking about?
So the YouTube channel is called Alexander Waugh, which is my name, and that's spelled Waugh. And if you type in Alexander Waugh, you'll get his channel, and it's all about Shakespeare. All of the videos there have been put into one of three playlists, if you like. And one of the most interesting playlists, I think, is Who Knew, and each one of the little presentations in there is called So and So Knew. So Ben Jonson knew, George Virtue knew, etc., etc., etc. And in each one of those, I take a contemporary of William Shakespeare's and I show how that person knew that he was in fact a pseudonym being used by the Earl of Oxford.
Some of them are so compelling, and some of them, of course, as well, because you're such a charming guy, very entertaining as well. And I know for some of our listeners, there are going to be names there that they maybe haven't learned yet or that they don't know yet, because you take some deep dives into some of the personalities that were involved, that who must have known this was going on at the time. So I will instruct listeners that when they go there, like, start looking at the ones that you recognize. Look at some of the names that you know. Obviously, everybody knows Ben Jonson, so you don't necessarily have to watch them in order, right? You can watch them in the order of relevance to you, and then you will find more and more information about some of these other people that Alexander features in the video series. But it's a great series.
Thank you. Yeah, no, you don't have to watch them in any particular order. Having said that, they feel to me quite like a work in progress. So I what's happened is, if ever I've found things wrong, which is actually, I have to say, very, very, very rare indeed, but if I find something's very rare, but I sometimes can improve rather than find it's wrong. I found a sort of better way of explaining it or looking at it. So what I've then done is add it to a next video. So I'll say, oh, by the way, in this past video, I think if you look at it this way, you'll see a better way of looking at it. No, I didn't mean to be conceited when I said I haven't found anything that's wrong, but I am pretty cautious and pretty self-censoring. So I haven't really. I found one thing which was a really stupid mistake when I thought 3 score was 60 when it was 36 or something, the other way around. But no, and then I just correct that. So yes, I mean,
sure.
they're just fun to. I think they're fun to dive in and just spend time and start getting the essential message that comes out of all of them, is that there were a hell of a lot of people there at the time who were telling us that Shakespeare was the pseudonym of Edward de Vere. So it really is odd when you think about it, the situation we have at the moment with modern Eng-lit academics who really don't understand or know any of this, just banging on saying that William Shakespeare was someone completely different when all of the contemporaries are saying they're wrong. I mean, I would always side with a contemporary over someone 400 years later who's just guessworking.
Absolutely. You know, being a former journalist, I can tell you that you commonly learn in the field of journalism that oftentimes the very first story is the most accurate. And
Precisely.
I think that what you're saying, and you know, it gets changed over time. Pundits get involved, people have spin doctors who get involved, and suddenly stories will change. But oftentimes the very first recorded facts and details are the most accurate in any situation or in any long-term story. That it's like that game that we play with children, right? Where we call it telephone, where you whisper into one child's ear some kind of detail and then they share it to the next child and the next child, the next child. And by the time it completes the circle, it's completely changed. It's a whole different story than what was originally spoken, right?
Yes, absolutely right. The people there on the ground at the time are bound to know much better than people 400 years later. There is, however, one, of course, small problem, which we have to admit to, which is all of those people who are telling us that the pseudonym was Edward de Vere's are saying it slightly cryptically. But the interesting thing about this is if you go to a modern professor of Shakespeare with his rigid Stratfordianist views, he will say, oh yes, all the contemporaries, when they write about William Shakespeare, they're writing cryptically about him. But they won't address the problem. The first problem, obviously, is why are they writing cryptically about him? What was it about William Shakespeare that was prohibited from overt expression by his contemporaries? And it's a very peculiar thing that they will all stand around and say, oh yes, this allusion to Shakespeare's cryptic, that one's cryptic, that one's cryptic. But they don't bother to address the central question is why? Why is this veiled writing about this? They're not veiled writing about Michael Drayton or Samuel Daniel or any other contemporary poets. But every single time Shakespeare's mentioned, you can see straight away that they're writing in a weird, almost nonsensical way. And once, of course, you realise what the secret is that they're all wanting to impart but having to hide, then it becomes quite simple.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think that, you know, there becomes this lens that you can put on. I call it the Oxfordian lens. And I think that once you start looking at the writings of some of these people, when you look at the writings that are accredited to the pseudonym William Shakespeare, like when you look at things through the Oxfordian lens, they suddenly start to make so much more sense. And things that I've seen English lit people struggle with explaining are so easily explained as soon as you fit the works to the right guy.
That's right, and I think that goes a long way to answering the question which is often put to Oxfordians by slightly tense Stratfordians, often with very stiff shoulders and clenching their fists as they say it, is why does it matter? What's the point? Why does it matter who actually wrote them so long as we've got the works? But I think what you've just said encapsulates it, and I think we could all give lots and lots of examples of parts of Shakespeare plays that absolutely come alive when you realise what is really being said because you know who's saying it and what the intention is behind their message. And I've certainly found on a personal level that my enjoyment of the plays has increased tenfold because of knowing who wrote them and understanding about that person and his personal life and his motivations and his thoughts.
And one of those people, and like I said at the top of the program, somebody that has been mentioned a few times here and there throughout the 3 years of episodes we've created of this podcast series, but who we haven't actually really deeply explored is this very mysterious figure named John Dee. And he is definitely someone who has had some influence on the works. And there are many of us who believe that he's even the muse or source of some of the major characters in some of the plays. Namely, particularly, I know a lot of people who believe that there's a lot of John Dee in the character of Prospero in The Tempest, for instance.
Well, that would certainly make sense in the sense that John Dee was the Prospero figure of England, that he was a sort of magician a talker to angels and some would say demons, though he would have denied that, and a mystic and a scholar, which is all the things that Prospero was. And if Shakespeare were basing the character of Prospero on anyone, and he was an Englishman around the English court, then that would certainly be John Dee, who'd be the top person. Quite interestingly, there is another character who's actually called Prospero, who had a great library in Milan and actually had proper title to the title Duke of Milan, which really ties in a lot. And he was called Prospero Visconti. I would think that someone of Shakespeare's great genius, on the whole, would base any character on more than one person. This was a technique used a lot by my grandfather, for instance, when he wrote novels and would take a person and he would have 3 or 4 people that he knew and he'd inject 3 or 4 people into one character. But I would say certainly that there's a part of Prospero which is John Dee. John Dee was a very controversial figure even in his lifetime and certainly afterwards. There was a great effort in the 17th century after his death to demolish him and turn him into someone of no interest at all. Fantastically interesting, actually, is right now as we speak, there's some American, I think, pop or musician called Ghost Domain, and I noticed that he's had something like 80 million hits with a song called John Dee. And that has created another modern flurry of interest in John Dee from all sorts of quarters, but particularly, I think, in his magic side. And there is a great question as to whether he was either a fool in some ways. We know he was a very, very clever person, but was he duped particularly by his right-hand man and scryer called Edward Kelly? Or was he a diabolist in some way? Was he playing with very dark forces? This was accusations certainly levelled at him in the 17th century after his death, that's what he was doing, and during his lifetime. And he wrote a lot of defences of his own work, saying absolutely not, he was a very pious Christian, which I think is actually the case, though I think his Christianity took a very different form from the standard church, and certainly from the Church of Rome or the Church of England.
Well, somehow, even though he was dabbling in what some people would describe as the dark arts, and, we have to remember, for us in modern times, what would be considered dark arts is so different than what it would have been considered back then. For instance, astrology was sometimes considered dark arts and the work of the devil. Whereas now, today, you can find it in just about every newspaper. You're going to find somebody's horoscope in there, so I think there's quite a difference in that time span, but for him to have been involved in the many things that he was, mysticism, numerology, astrology, alchemy, and to have survived and not have been burnt at the stake, I think must be a testament to his intelligence, his clever ability to wiggle out of the Inquisition of sorts that he went through in his lifetime, as well as his ability to demonstrate that he was truly a God-fearing man.
Yes, and that, of course, comes back to some of the reason why a lot of his works and his writings are very difficult to understand. He was careful not to say precisely what he meant because he knew he could get into trouble for quite a lot of these things. As far as his talking to angels and demons, he was very clear that he wished never to talk to. He accepted that there were such a thing as good spirits and bad spirits, and that he never wanted to commune or talk to bad spirits at all. But sometimes they accidentally, if you like, popped up through the crystal ball and caused mayhem. What's so fascinating about Dee is that he kept this very, very secret diary about all his seances with these spirits and hid it away. And these diaries were hid inside a chest, and long after his death in the late 17th century, the chest was discovered with a secret compartment in it, and the manuscripts that were in it were taken to Elias Ashmole, who started up the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. So all of these diaries are preserved, and in them he takes down the dialogues of what the spirit said, and the questions that he asked the spirits and the answers. I don't think there's another record like this anywhere. So it really is extraordinarily fascinating that this has survived and is now the subject of a great deal of study by people who are very interested in Dee.
And people who have been interested in this topic in modern times, I mean, immediately when you're describing his diaries and his discussions with spirits, which comes to mind the term transmedium, which is a more modern term for that type of psychic ability. I immediately, what is called to mind is somebody like Edgar Cayce in modern times. So you're saying John Dee is like an early version of an Edgar Cayce, perhaps?
Well, I think all this sort of stuff has gone on for centuries and centuries. So he was absolutely by no means the first person onto it, and by absolutely no means the last. I mean, all this interacting with the spirit world, as I say, is a very, very ancient art, and certainly he believed it very ancient, and he was an avid collector of ancient manuscripts and books that would help him to work out how to open up these portals, how to summon up these spirits, but also how to get rid of them when he had had enough of them. And so there's a lot of stuff in his literature about this is the way you summon this particular spirit up, and this is the way you get rid of this particular spirit. And it's often done in words, but there's also the geometry. We're all used to seeing sort of weirdo horror films and things with pentagons drawn on the floor. But that is literally what John Dee was doing. He was drawing pentagons on the floor and using certain sets of words and things to summon up these spirits. And, of course, nowadays there are a lot of people who will say, well, he's just a fool. But I think nobody can doubt that he was, in so many other respects, a very, very clever man. I mean, he was an absolutely brilliant mathematician, and we know that Lord Burleigh, and the Queen were using him as a spy, and he was very obsessed with cryptology. So that's another point. Trithemius was one of his famous authors. He went to great lengths to get Trithemius's book, which is called Steganography, which is all about encryptions. And so that's why I think it is absolutely fascinating that, in my view, he provided the great encryption dealing with the Shakespeare authorship, which is hidden on the front page and the dedication of Shakespeare's sonnets, which was published in 1609.
You have a great piece about that on your YouTube channel, and I encourage my listeners to go to that and view that, and they'll have a greater understanding of what you're talking about. What I'd like to find out from you a little bit, because I know that, you know, one of the wonderful things about this program is the wide range of listeners that we have, and so many different countries around the world, and all of them in varying degrees of having been introduced to the authorship question. You know, some of them are 30-year-long Oxfordians, and some of them are 3-month long.
I don't know whether you can hear me, but
yes,
you seem to have been cut. You seem
can
to have
you
been cut.
still hear me?
I can now. You were cut off for a very short time. You were talking about a wide range of listeners from different backgrounds, and then you cut off.
Yes, and many of them have either been they run the gamut, basically, of how long they've been interested in this, from brand new newcomers to, you know, decades-long researchers. And so one of the things that I'd like to touch on for a moment, if you would, is explain, where does John Dee come from? What's his background? How does he come on to the scene of Elizabethan England to then be able to play a part in the Shakespeare authorship?
Yes, so John Dee was an Englishman, but he had very ancient Welsh blood. He was very proud of that Welsh blood, and he thought it was quite highborn Welsh blood. His father was involved in the English court. He went to he went to Cambridge University, St. John's, and then became a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and was noticed, obviously, very early for being extremely clever, not just in mathematics, in geometry. That was his big thing, and he actually became quite famous abroad. Perhaps he was famous abroad before he was really famous in England, and his reputation abroad became known in England. So, for instance, he went to Paris, where he made a series of lectures on Euclid, and to great ovation. And the word spread about him, and people came to Paris from across Europe to hear him talk. And then, of course, it got known in England that he had made a great reputation for himself abroad. How he got into the sort of magic side of things and the God side of things, I think that was very much a part of the intellectual world of the Renaissance. And so he was reading books which talked a lot about geometry, about maths, and came to the very central conclusion, the central philosophy of those times, which was based on the fact that God created the world using letters and numbers, and that, as Dee himself said, all things have their being in number. Actually, you get that in the Book of Wisdom. And so, therefore, to get close to God, what you need to do is study everything in the world. So in other words, be what we would now call a scientist. And by studying the things in the world, you are studying God's creation, and God's creation is inseparable from God himself. So by studying it, you're getting closer to God. And so this is what empowered, if you like, or inspired a lot of the scientific, they would call themselves philosophers in those days. It was a wish to get to God, to understand God through his creation, i.e. through the world. So that's that, and the cosmos. So that's studying the planets, the stars, the trees, animals, whatever you want. Anything you're studying is getting you closer to God. So he was part of that drift. And when at the beginning of the 16th century, we suddenly find this huge interest going on in a character called Hermes Trismegistus and the Neoplatonic school of Florence, John Dee latches onto that very big time. Now, the point of Hermes, if you ever hear the expression hermetic thought, that means thought according to Hermes, this character Hermes Trismegistus. Now, in those days, it was believed that Hermes was very, very ancient Egyptian, who was a contemporary of Moses, who left this corpus of writing known as the Hermetic Corpus. And you can still buy that today. You can buy it in a very good English translation by someone called Copenhagen. I must say, when I read them for the first time, I got complete shivers throughout my whole spine and body. They're just the most extraordinary bits of writing about God and the nature of the universe and the nature of things. Anyway, this character, Hermes, really, really set on fire the imaginations of thinkers in the Renaissance, including people like Leonardo da Vinci and John Dee and Shakespeare. We can see huge traces of Hermetic thought in Shakespeare. And so I think it's very important to understand the Geist, that great spirit of Hermes that transcends through all these intellectual minds at that time. And once you understand that, then you can understand a lot of what Shakespeare's talking about, a lot about what John Dee's talking about. And of course, it helped me to unlock the secrets of the dedication of Shakespeare's sonnets.
So Dee, one of the things that I think probably helped Dee throughout his lifetime escape the fire of the stake by those who would claim that he was a heretic or a demonologist was the fact that he was in tight with some very prominent people, including the Queen of England, right? So I know that if you look at biographies of him, one of the first things that you find is that he was Elizabeth's astrologer. You mentioned just a moment ago that Elizabeth and Burleigh used him for some spying and for other things. How does he get that close to those many powerful people through his lifetime?
Well, because I think essentially because Queen Elizabeth trusted him, and she would go to him. She would sometimes just turn up at his door at Mortlake without an invitation, as it were, and say to him, I have the French ambassador, whatever, coming on over. What's the best day to give him a banquet? What's the best day to anything, have a coronation or do this or do that? And so he did a lot of divining, and he divined very early on that her reign would be a great success, etc., etc. And so she trusted him. She trusted this mystic side of him. And and of course what happens is when the Queen trusts someone, then even those people around her who distrust that person, they're inclined to not chop off their heads, for starters. So yeah, but I mean, there's no question that Dee had enemies within the court, some who thought he was talking claptrap, and some who thought that he was actually dangerous, that he was opening up portals to dark forces that would possibly destroy the kingdom, even destroy the world. So he had great enemies. James didn't like him very much, and a lot of his last years he was kind of rather exiled and away from the court and out of it. James, of course, as you remember, was terrified of witches and spells.
Yes.
And sorcery. And James originally wanted to marry a Danish princess. I think, was she the sister of Anne? I don't remember right now. But he blamed, this is when he was still King of Scotland, he blamed Dee for casting spells on that arrangement and causing it to stop. He did eventually then marry Anne of Denmark, but it's thought that he never really forgave Dee for what he thought Dee had done.
That's very interesting, and I know. So the thing about Elizabeth's court is you could come in and out of favor very quickly, especially if you had enemies who were doing everything they could behind the scenes to slip you up, find a chink in your armor, look for the tender underbelly, and stick the knife as deep as possible whenever possible. And somehow he survived all of that. But that there were people in the Elizabethan court who sort of viewed him as a Rasputin type of character. There are parallels there, I think. And yet he stays in favor with her. And one could argue that the only reason that is so is because he was accurate. He was good at what he did. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree with that. But one of the factors we have to look at always is the way Queen Elizabeth played her courtiers and played her favourites. That, I mean, for instance, if you take a character like Edward DeVere, the Earl of Oxford, I mean, he had great enemies within the court and as well as friends. Elizabeth seemed to be using him, as far as we can make out, as her court jester, her wise man, her clever man. But she, in his view, she was never taking him very seriously, and yet she wanted him around. Now, if you look at the characters of Walsingham, of Burleigh and Leicester, who were at each other's throats a lot of the time, it's almost as though Queen Elizabeth picked people of great talent to be around her who would grate on each other, so that no one of them could get so much favour as to unbalance or possibly even topple her. I don't know if I'm right here, I'm guessing, but it just seems there's something clever going on with Queen Elizabeth and the people around her, that she is picking people who are naturally disposed to dislike each other, and yet they will all be satellites around her, and to some extent keep the others in check if they try to get too big or above themselves. So I think Dee plays a little part as one of the planets around there. She calls him my ubiquitous eyes, which is surely a way of making Hatton jealous, who was known as my lids, and Leicester, who was known as my eyes. Interestingly, Leicester draws two round circles to show that he is Elizabeth's eyes with dots in the middle. And John Dee also does two circles, but with a 7 over it. So we get the 007, hence the oft-stated connection between James Bond and John Dee, the ubiquitous eyes. And the 7, of course, is the number that ties Dee's name, which is 7 letters, John Dee, to God. And so that's what's going on in that little symbol of 007.
I'm guessing right now, as my listeners are listening to this, they are blown away by the James Bond connection, as I am, because I had never heard that till this very moment, and that's really cool. Well,
it's quite cool. I mean, it is quite cool, but I think you'll find some people contesting it. That there's no doubt that he did write this 007 in this way. And there's no doubt that the 00 was being used as a symbol relating to eyes both by Leicester, and we know that D was called Ubiquitous Eye. So it does tie in and make sense. But you'll find a lot about it on the internet, and I personally think it is correct. More often, though, you'll find John Dee signing himself not 007, but ID, which of course is his initials, or just with a triangle. And he's using a triangle to represent the Trinity, but also the three letters of D, and it is the triangle is the capital delta of Greek, which is
yes,
the
of course. I was about
D.
to say yes. It's the delta, and I know, for instance, anybody who has done any dabbling in law, right? They use pi and delta for prosecution and defense as shorthand. So,
yes,
but do we have any evidence that Ian Fleming was influenced by that when he created James Bond, or no?
I'm not a Fleming expert, but I do know that quite a lot of people have looked into this, and you can find out about it by rambling around on the internet. No, there are certainly people who seem to think, and where they get it from, I don't know, that 007 was drawn from D, but I'm not an expert, and I'm afraid I can't answer that question properly.
What is the connection between what kind of information and evidence do we have about the connection between Edward DeVere and John Dee? How much did they know each other? How much interaction did they have? What kind of research have you done that you found that connect those two men together?
So there's two types of evidence about this. Well, actually, there's three, but the two main ones are that there's no great evidence and common sense prevails, and I'll come to that secondly. But the first bit of documentary evidence, which is very small, is when John Dee boasts, when he's being accused of all these awful things, and quite late, I think this is the beginning of the 17th century, and then he writes a whole list of boasts of people who have favoured him to show that he's a good egg and not a baddie. And one of those boasts is to say that the Earl of Oxford wrote letters of commendation about him in 1570. This is actually quite interesting because 1570 is the year that he publishes his very famous preface to Euclid. And so one is presuming that Oxford was writing letters of commendation about that preface in 1570. And it's in that preface that Dee says, you must find the number of your name and align it to the Trinity. And it was through that sentence that I realised that Oxford had found the number of his name and aligned it to the Trinity. And the number of his name was 1740. And this is a number you find absolutely everywhere in references to Shakespeare. You find this 1740. And the whole thing culminates in the year 1740 when the great marble statue of Shakespeare is lowered down in Westminster Abbey onto the spot where Oxford is buried. So that's the first part of the answer to your question about the connections between Dee and Oxford. The documentary evidence is slim. However, the fact of the matter is that Dee was the big brain box around court, and therefore Oxford would have known him extremely well and would have been particularly interested in him because Oxford, as we all know, was an intellect. And we know that Oxford, from rude things said about him, was dabbling around in alchemy, in necromancy, and all of these things would have been centred on John Dee. So there's no question that he would have known Dee very well, and there's no question that anyone who's actually studied Oxford and his intellectual interests that he would have taken a great interest in Dee's works and in the books that Dee was reading. And as I said, this connection with the Hermetic thought is very much in common with Dee. Finally, I would say that we know that John Dee spent a lot of time with Oxford's oldest daughter Elizabeth, who was then Countess of Derby, in the early years of the 17th century. That, funnily enough, is in the run-up to the publication of the Shakespeare sonnets and that encrypted dedication.
Correct. And so that great. That puts me right in line with the next thing I wanted to ask you, which is how does he, because you obviously believe that he plays a large hand in the publication of the sonnets, 1609, correct?
Well, yeah, that's the date that's printed on them, and I think it's correct up to a point.
Okay, so explain, if you would, for us all, because I know I'm overwhelmingly intrigued right now, and I know my listeners are too. And I know some of you who are listening, I know that you do this because you write to me and you tell me that you go back and listen to the episode a second time or a third time to make sure that you don't miss anything or to take notes on things that you want to look up on the internet or whatever extra research you want to do. And that's one of the things that I love about this program is it inspires that kind of quest in our listeners. But fill us in, share with us, how does he play a role in the publication of the sonnets?
Well, the first thing that I realized about the sonnet's dedication is that it is cast into three triangles. In other words, the text of that dedication is written as a triangle at the top, a triangle in the middle, and a triangle at the bottom. Now, the three triangles, the 3 times 3, is something that is very proto-Masonic and that points almost straight away to D, not just because he signed his name with a triangle, but this idea of 3 triangles and 3 times 3. There's a wonderful line in Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost where someone says, "Thrice 3 is 9." And Costard replies, "Not so, sir, we know what we know." And everybody laughs because they think that's just Costard being thick and he doesn't really know that 3 3s are 9. But actually there's something very clever going on there because Dee had this obsession with the idea that the Trinity, that's to say Father, Son and Holy Ghost, the Divine Trinity, actually consisted of a concealed quaternary as well, that it had this fourth part, that it was at once a threefold and fourfold Trinity. And what he meant by that is the quaternary, which are the 4 elements, that's earth, fire, water and air, from which it was believed that absolutely everything in the material world, the cosmos, the stars, the planets, everything we see, ourselves, our chairs, our tables, whatever, is made up of these 4 elements. So what he was saying, Dee, is that the Godhead consists of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's the ternary, and concealed within it is God's creation, everything that he made, i.e. the 4 elements. So that's at the root of Dee's thinking, and that is what we find in the sonnet's dedication, is this 3 plus 1, or the quaternary that is hidden within the ternary. And it was by using this. It sounds like a complicated idea, but once you get your head around it, it's quite simple. And it's by using that as the key that I managed to unlock, with the help of other clever Oxfordians, I have to say. It's not a total solo job, this, but to unlock the mystery and to find out exactly what that sonnet's dedication is hiding. And this is what is so extraordinary about it. I don't know how many of your listeners right now can see that sonnet's dedication in their mind's eye. But as I say,
oftentimes in the middle of an episode, I will tell listeners, hit pause, go find your copy of the sonnets. If you don't have one, look it up online. There are images all over the internet, and open up your computer while you're listening to the rest of the episode and look at what we're talking about. And you're right, that introductory page of the sonnets, it would make E.E. Cummings spin his head, because it's definitely structured in a way to create a specific image in the poetry. And,
well, that's correct. So it's the dedication we're talking about. So if you go to the internet and type in sonnets dedication, an image will come up of that, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about the 3 triangles. And if you read it, you'll see it's a very odd, almost nonsensical bit of prose, signed off TT at the bottom with dots, or what you call points, I think. What do Americans call full stops? Something else. With dots, anyway.
The points of the triangle? Yep.
No, I mean what I call a full stop, but I think Americans have a different word for it. Do you call them points? Anyway, the dots between each of the words. There's every word has a dot, and then the next word, and then a dot, and then another one. And it is all very weird, but once you understand what's going on, it is all very significant. And all I will say, because it's impossible to explain it really without a proper visual presentation, but what I can say about that sonnet's dedication that looks so simple and so odd at the same time is that it is concealing a colossal amount of information. And one of those bits of information is telling you what city Shakespeare is buried in, what parish of that city, what church within that parish, and what exact spot within the church, within that parish, that he is buried. It is also telling you on multiple occasions that he was Edward DeVere. And it also tells you what the first 17 sonnets, at least, are all about. And all that is hidden in those three triangles. It is a kind of miracle, and it is only a brain like John Dee who could have done that. But what we also see there is he signs himself off. He signs his name in very critical places along the way of that decryption. So that's what gives me the real confidence that it really was done by John Dee. It's not just we can't think of anyone with the brain power to do it apart from John Dee. He actually seems to be signing his name, as I say, in very critical spots along the route of that message.
And you believe that he was working in conjunction with Oxford's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, in the process of getting these sonnets published then?
Well, that's a possibility because we know he was meeting her quite a lot in the run-up to that. But, you know, I'm now entering the world of speculation, and I slightly think that he actually connived this with Oxford himself. I suspect that dedication existed in some form or another before Oxford's death. Now, why then did it suddenly get published in 1609? I mean, I'm sure there will be a reason for that. We're seeing more and more that specific dates are being waited for by proto-Masonic minds in order to do things. 1717, the opening of the Grand Lodge in London, was a specific date that they waited a long time for. The placing of the Shakespeare monument upon Oxford's grave in 1740. I cannot believe, when you see the importance of 1740 and how it represents the number of Edward de Vere's name lined up to the Trinity, I cannot believe that they hadn't decided that monument was going to go there in 1740, 100 years before or more. They waited and waited, and 1740 was the date they were going to put it up, and then they put it up there, and they put 1740 4 times on it. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. So this seems to be...
Where is that located for
it's in Westminster Abbey. It's in Westminster Abbey, in what is now called Poets' Corner. And the extraordinary thing about it is in 1977, some idiots, I don't want to be rude, but I can only describe them as idiots, carved upon it William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, buried at Stratford-upon-Avon. Now, what's so weird about that is there you go to the spot where Edward de Vere is buried, with a statue of Shakespeare above it, and you get this 1977 thing saying, go up to Stratford-upon-Avon if you want to find where he's really buried. Then you go up to Stratford-upon-Avon, and that monument tells you that he's buried in Westminster Abbey. So one's being treated like a ping-pong ball between these two monuments.
That's actually fascinating, and it's like one of those geocaching games or something, you know, where, well, it's a, you know, wild goose chase, the snipe hunt, whatever you want to call it. But that in itself is an enigma that is worth exploring. You know, Dan Brown couldn't create that. You know what I mean?
That's right. Well, I discovered that the monument in Stratford was telling us that he was buried near to Chaucer, Spenser and Beaumont some years ago. I mean, 7 or 8 years ago, and since then I discovered 6 witnesses in the 17th century who were all telling us that Shakespeare was indeed buried in Westminster Abbey. And what's so extraordinary about this is you know, these testimonies were known about. They've been known about for a long time. And you know, for instance, there's a man called Sir John Denham, a very, very high up man in the Freemasons in the late 17th century. And he writes that Shakespeare's buried in Westminster Abbey. And if you look at any scholarly note, they put a little footnote saying, oh, John Denham got that wrong, didn't he? He's buried in Stratford-upon-Avon. Well, of course, John Denham didn't get it wrong. He was very, very close to the king. He was an extremely clever man. He was a very high up Freemason. He knew exactly what he was saying. And that's what's so interesting is when you follow the people who knew where he was buried all the time, they always link back to this Freemasonry. So, in fact, the monument as I say, that was placed in 1740 upon Edward de Vere's grave in Westminster Abbey, was put there by Lord Burlington. It had words on it by the poet Alexander Pope. It was carved by William Kent. Designed by William Kent. Now, all three of those people were known Freemasons. So they're all part of a little tight inner circle that's passing this secret down, not just over the years, but the decades, and now we're seeing the centuries. So it's a very, very, very interesting thing.
Reflecting back on the use of the triangle, I mean, the triangle is a huge symbol in Freemasonry. And so there you get this, other connection that you've been pointing out, this three-pointed structure that is representative of so many things, whether you're looking at it as the trinity of the God figure, or you're looking at it as what is used in building things. It's a tool of the Freemasons, right? And you had a symbol for D and a symbol for a letter of the Greek alphabet. And then you talk about letters and numbers. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier on that I wanted to reflect back on is when you talk about letters and numbers and symbols and D's belief that all of that is the math of God, as it were, then it makes me think about the Hebrew language, where letters and numbers are interchangeable and have values that are connected, right?
Correct, yes. And Dee, of course, was a very good Hebrew scholar. And what I didn't mention to you is when he signs his name with a triangle, he also puts a little dot after that triangle. And that dot in Hebrew is what's called a hierix. And in Hebrew, you don't have letters for vowels. You only have letters for consonants. So you have if you have a D sound, whether it's the letter D or a triangle, which is a delta in Greek, by putting a single dot after it, it means pronounced E after the vowel. So you've got your triangle, which is the D, and then the hierix, which is E. So it's triangle dot, which also gives you this 3 plus 1. So you've got your triangle, which represents 3, the plus 1, which is the dot. Again, it's back to this quaternary concealed within the ternary. And as I said, the delta is the fourth letter, just as in English, the D is the fourth letter of the English alphabet.
This is all extremely fascinating. And one of the things it does also make me recall is I had Roger Strittmatter on as a guest. He's been on a guest a couple of times. And one of the episodes, and listeners can go back and find the episode, he came on to discuss the book of Oxford's poetry that he produced. And he chose for the cover this engraving. I think it might be a wood carving that then was a rubbing. And it's a man in a funeral shroud, and I don't recall who it's supposed to represent, but when we were having our discussion, I pointed out that the figure is writing backwards. He's writing from right to left, not left to right. I said, do you think that figure is representative of somebody who's writing in Hebrew? And suddenly we had this revelation of, oh my God, he absolutely, I think it was supposed to be Nash in the engraving.
It's Green, yeah, Robert Green.
Oh, Green. Okay, and he's writing backwards. He's writing in Hebrew. It's the only language at that time that they would have been writing that direction, right?
Well, yes. I mean, that's a possibility. There is, of course, another possibility is that the engraver made a very simple mistake. Because if you think about it, when you do a woodcut or indeed an engraving, the thing is in reverse. So you then put it down into the ink and print it so it comes out back to front. So it is possible that what looked correct to the engraver as he was hatching it out onto a piece of wood, if it's a woodcut or a piece of brass, whatever it was, came out in reverse when it was printed, and he hadn't thought of that simple point. So, look, I have the highest admiration for Roger Strittmatter, I have to say, who I think is one of the cleverest and most eloquent voices in the Oxfordian movement. And he could be right, but there is that other possible explanation.
Well, I'm going to go with that it was intended rather than it was a mistake.
Well,
but I haven't done any research into it.
In principle, Stephen, I agree with you 100%, because we see so often this view, particularly with Stratfordians, oh, it was just a mistake. And we even have on that dedication to the sonnets, to the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H. Oh, that was a mistake. It should have been S.W., W.S., meaning William Shakespeare. The amount of things we're told that are just a mistake. And it was actually by my rigid rejection of it was just a mistake that I found out so many things, because you have to look at what are mistakes and wonder why they've been done. And it's often because they're trying to relay a message. So, yes, I don't know why I tried to push the idea of this writing not being Hebrew. It's just a mistake, because it goes against all of my inner principles. One should look at these things very carefully and generally take the view that it's intentional and then ask why.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned when you said that in that preface to the sonnets, the triangles, the dots, the formation of lines that is that you can find there, that your YouTube video points out tremendously, by the way. But you also said that you believe that it indicates the meanings of the first 17 sonnets. Can you elaborate a little further on that? What is Dee trying to tell us in code there about those first 17 sonnets?
Yes, so essentially, just for those who don't know at all what's going on here, my theory is that that dedication is unlocked by meditating and thinking about the letter T. And there are lots of reasons for that, because there's lots of messages about T in it. And there's this sign called the triple tau. And the triple tau is represented by the number 19 for reasons I don't need to bother you with. The T itself is the 19th letter of the alphabet, of the Roman alphabet, that is, and also of the Greek alphabet. Tau is the 19th letter. And if you count the T's in that dedication, there are 19 of them. So 3 times we're getting this idea of 19. Now, we know that Dee was an absolute obsessive of putting letters into grids. In one manuscript alone, he has 49 grids with letters all put in them that you're supposed to read diagonally or vertically or downwards. So the obvious idea then is to put that dedication into a grid which has 19 columns in it, because of this importance of 19, of unlocking things. So in that grid, you will find a series of glyphs. These are little pictorial glyphs which have messages inside them. The first one, for instance, is the ground plan of Westminster Abbey with the Westminster written inside it, and various signs around it which verify it. And the second half of that grid, this 19-column grid that I'm talking about, has 3 glyphs. And those 3 glyphs, there's one which is a big cross, there's one which is a slightly phallic emblem, and there's another which is an upside-down cross representing 1740. And these ones contain messages. And what the messages are saying is that Edward de Vere lied about the paternity of his son. And this is something that seems to come up in Sonnet 17, where he says that poet lied. And the strange aspect of the first 17 sonnets, where Shakespeare is absolutely determined to get this fair youth to beget an heir for him. And it's such a weird thing to be asking to happen. But this explains what those first 17 sonnets about, and in fact what the 18th sonnet about, which says that the child has been born. So at the root of all this, and the names are all in there as well, if you look at it, the root of all this is that Edward de Vere seems to have persuaded the fair youth, that is Henry Rosalie, to beget a son for him, and that son was then claimed as Edward de Vere's son and became the 18th Earl of Oxford. In truth, it had no business to be the 18th Earl of Oxford, because it was the natural son of the Earl of Southampton. And this is a story that I've been tracing in a whole lot of different contemporary literature about Shakespeare. So there's a lot of corroboration for it, and there it sits in this sonnet dedication. And I think it's this sin that Vere is asking forgiveness for. There are some lying, by the way.
There are some who would argue that he was the rightful 18th Earl of Oxford, because if he is the son of Henry Rosalie, then he is the grandson of Edward de Vere.
Yeah, but the problem with that is that titles don't go through illegitimate lines, so that he couldn't be He couldn't be the Earl of Oxford. But I agree that is a very interesting line of inquiry, because it brings up the question, why, if this thesis is correct, why would Edward de Vere be so insistent that it's the Earl of Southampton rather than anybody else who fathers this heir for him? And of course, it would make a lot of sense if Southampton were Oxford's illegitimate son, at least in terms of bloodline. But in terms of title, it makes no difference whatsoever. If you're illegitimate, you simply cannot inherit a title, full stop. So it's the
Sure,
end
absolutely. I totally understand that, and I get that, and that's one of the issues with the whole titles being passed on, right? And that question is brought up often in the works of Shakespeare. When you look at Lear and you have the Edgar Edmund issue,
Yes.
There are fewer places where that could be painted out more clearly. What is this term legitimacy, and why is it so important, and why does it matter? But I believe that our guy...
Yes, why bastard, wherefore base, he says.
Right, exactly. And I believe that our guy, Edward, was more concerned about bloodline and DNA. He didn't know what DNA was at the time, but I think he was more concerned about that than he was about the legitimacy of title, because I think he had seen so often so many people accepting children as theirs who they really weren't theirs, and how many men claimed sons that weren't actually their sons in order to continue the title, even though people knew outwardly that that is not your kid.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. But of course, there's a whole lot of evidence pointing to this scenario being correct. But the one thing we don't know, of course, is the inner motivations of the people involved. And it's not just the motivation of Oxford himself to surrogate a son, but also the motivation of the Countess of Oxford, his wife, who's his second wife, and what role did she play in it? We just don't know, and it's maddening because we've got lots of things pointing at them saying this is what they did, but we don't really understand their motivations. I'll just say a few things on this. One is that if you were an earl or a member of the nobility in those days, there was a great duty upon you to beget an heir, that it wasn't just a little luxury and a joke and a family thing, that the lines of nobility were decorations, if you like, or extensions of the crown itself, and therefore they had a duty to Commonwealth, to the nation, to the crown, to produce an heir. So it was a bit more than just you or I, Stephen, saying, "Oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a son?" There was more to it than that, and more duty, more compunction. So that may have played some sort of part in it. There's a very interesting line, if you remember, in Troilus and Cressida, where the honey-sweet Lord Pandarus persuades his niece Cressida to go to bed with Troilus, and he says to her, "If you beget an heir, if you beget a boy, can I have it?" Well, it's an extraordinary thing to say.
Right?
I mean, but you see, Shakespeare cannot resist putting bits of autobiography in all of his plays. So I mean, it's just
absolutely. I agree with that wholeheartedly. It's very much like Merlin saying to Arthur, "Okay, fine, I'll help you sleep with Igraine, but the fruit of that union becomes mine to raise."
I didn't know that. How interesting. Thank you. Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah, that's that's connected to the Arthurian legend, right? Like Merlin says so Arthur lusts for Igraine, who is the wife, I believe, of the Duke of Cornwall, and Merlin uses his magic to allow Arthur to lay with her one night. But the deal is if there is a child born from this union, you will give it to me to raise, and that's how Merlin ends up raising Arthur, who he nicknames Newt as he's raising him, to then later become the once and future king. That's the mythology.
Right. That's very interesting. Another thing, by the way, on Oxford is we have his Bible, which Roger Strickmatter has studied and written very interestingly about. And that Bible is in the Folger Library, and he's underlined quite a lot of bits of it. And one of the things he underlines is that bit of Jesus when Jesus says, a man who takes another son as his own will be blessed by God. So I think that my view in this is that Edward de Vere thought he was doing absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, his favourite book, one of his favourite books was Cardana's Comfort. This is a book of philosophy that was published at his commandment in English, and he was obviously obsessed by it, known as Hamlet's book, because it seems to contain a lot of the bits of to be and not to be speech, things like that. But in that book, it is said that a person who takes another man's son for his own will be blessed by God. And so I think in surrogating an heir, Oxford believed he did nothing wrong at all. But where he felt that he had sinned was in lying about it, i.e. allowing that son to call himself, after his death, the 18th Earl of Oxford. That seems to be where the need for penance came.
Another really important aspect of that story, too, regardless of what you believe, what we do know for a fact is that the two Henrys were practically inseparable in life. So that would lend credence to the idea that Henry Wriothesley was the true father of Henry de Vere, because they become tight as thieves and end up dying together off at war, right? Like under mysterious circumstances too, I might add. But here, these men who you're theorizing are actually father and son go on to become so extremely close that there are pieces of art that depict the two of them together.
Oh, yes, and more than that, I think the engravers knew perfectly well. There's one particular engraving, I think it's by Robert Vaughan, which is an engraving of the 18th Earl of Oxford, which is actually copied and very slightly changed in small parts from an engraving of Southampton. And there are lots and lots of clues in that engraving that what the engraver is secretly saying is that Henry Vere is Southampton's son. And there's another famous engraving of the two of them on horses, which again seems to be coded to give exactly that message, that the one is actually the son of the other, and that Southampton is in a sense stolen the name of Vere. His bloodline has taken over the name of Vere.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting sequence of events there then that tie these three men together. Okay. And I think that it's something that my listeners definitely need to go and do some more research on and look into. They definitely need to find your YouTube channel and look at the YouTube presentation that you have there about the dedication of the sonnets, about John Dee, as well as your Who Knew series, which is very fascinating. And one question I have for you, the presentation that you recently gave, is that going to be added to your YouTube channel anytime soon?
Well, it might be. I think we need to get in touch with this organisation called Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable, because they were the ones who conducted that interview, and I believe they recorded it, that speech. And so they might be putting it out on their channel. I will probably put it out too, but I think they should get the first bite of it, since they organised it and it was their thing. So can you hold your breath on that one? If I discover that the Shakespeare Roundtable are not putting it out online, then I'll put it out. But it'll probably come out on their channel first, as it were.
And before we wrap up, what is next on the horizon for you? What do you deeply have your fingers into right now? What can we be expecting from you in the very near future?
Well, I with the great, august, and highly learned Roger Stripmatter, have written 2 volumes of a scholarly edition reference book on Shakespeare allusions. And that is all finished, and it's going through its final editing and cleaning up. So I hope that will come out next year. It's in 2 volumes and it's over 1,000 pages, so it's a big thing. But what you can do with this book is look up any of the times that Shakespeare was mentioned by his contemporaries, and it shows how all of them were perfectly aware that this was a pseudonym used by the Earl of Oxford. And it'll be called the New Shakespeare Allusion Book. As I say, I hope it will be out next year. And the other thing I'm doing right at the moment is writing a script, a 9-part dramatised life of Vere. which will obviously deal with the fact of his being Shakespeare, but also deals with the many, many utterly fascinating aspects of Vere's life. I mean, he had the most extraordinary life as an adventurer, as a person with huge ups and downs and squabbles and high praise and great contempt thrown upon him. So it's a fascinating life, which is going to happen in 9 parts. And maybe some of your listeners who have been listening to the conversation we've been having just now will understand why it's in 9 parts and what sort of conclusions are going to be drawn at the very end of it. The symbolism of 9.
As a matter of fact, and I'm thrilled to hear that you're doing that, because it's been mentioned on this program multiple times, and myself coming from a strong theatrical background, I believe this story needs to be dramatized. I believe that it needs to be a series on Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu or whatever content provider that is out there that is making these wonderful historical fiction, historical nonfiction series that we've seen that are so well received by the public. And I think that something along that nature could really blow the doors off of the Oxfordian movement. I think if you have something that consumers can binge watch on this, that's intriguing, that's dramatic, and all the elements are there. Like anything you could possibly want is there in the life of this man, whether or not you believe he's Shakespeare. His life is fascinating one way or the other, regardless. And I think it's long overdue that he be the protagonist of a lengthy series of episodes that need to be made.
Yeah, well, that is exactly the motivation. That's what's behind it. We're very lucky. We've got a lot of support for this, and we've got a really considerable pot of seed money to entice producers and all the sort of team, a really good top team, into this. But ultimately, I think it is something that we are aiming towards, as you said, Amazon Prime, Netflix, HBO. It's one of that sort of series, and it's full of action, incident, squabble, and magic. John Dee appears in it, and so there's plenty of magic, and it ends with the great unveiling of where he's buried, of course.
That's fantastic. I look forward to that. I'm excited about that. I think that something like that could be finally what we need to cause the paradigm shift that we are, I think, on the verge of now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree. But it's quite a way to go. I've finished parts 1, 2, and 3. I'm halfway through part 4. I hope to get the script finished probably by the summer. But I've already been speaking to producers. I've been speaking to casting agents and people. So we really hope the wheels are going to turn on this and turn well. But it's obviously takes time, these sorts of things.
Well, that's fantastic news. I know that's fantastic news for our listeners as well. I want to thank you, Alexander, for taking the time to join us from all the way across the pond for what has been a fascinating episode of the series. I do hope that you'll come back again and share some more of your findings as well as what you've been working on in the future for a future episode. And I want to remind everybody once again to find, you can look it up, folks, Alexander Waugh, W-A-U-G-H. If you type that into your search engine, he will pop up. His YouTube channel will pop up, even on your smart TV, because I've done it on my own smart TV here in my living room. And he pops right up, and you will find all of his wonderful videos. And you can YouTube rabbit hole with Alexander for several hours, like my wife and I just recently did, as a matter of fact, I will confess. Thank you so much, sir, for your time and for joining us and sharing this insight.
Thank you, Stephen. It's been an honor to be on it, and I'll certainly come back if you ask me. That'd be great.
We do want to remind everybody who's listening that if they want to find out more information, they can, of course, go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. I know that we didn't even mention you're the president of the DeVere Society over there in England, and people can go to the DVS website as well and find out information there as well. And don't forget, folks, what we always say at the end of every program, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.